We have had a number of armchair meetings. As you see, we have taken away the armchairs because we are going to be many up here today. So there is no room for the armchair, it's pushed inside there somewhere. These armchair meetings have discussed the world changes, the many difficult problems that we are meeting with Trump, with Brexit, with climate change, with all kinds of global public goods and the challenges we have. And we have tried to look at them continent by continent. So we had a meeting here early spring on Africa, we had one on Latin America. Next week we are going to have one on China. But today we have taken the opportunity with a visit from a team from ECDPM. Andrew is going to tell you what ECDPM stands for in a few minutes, who are a think tank dealing with the Europe-Africa relationships on all levels. On the macro level, political, on the detail level, and when it comes to trade, when it comes to all kinds of things, and also the EU budget, as you heard. And we have taken the opportunity, and we are going to ask them now to do a presentation. It's Andrew Sheriff and Mariella Di Ciomo. Was it right?
Yes.
Almost right. And Mariella will come back later, particularly when in the question and answer session. So Andrew will start with an overall presentation, and I will follow up with a number of questions where I think he hasn't been detailed enough, if necessary. Okay. And then we leave the floor open for you. This is I'm very happy to see Andrew here. He's an old friend. We have worked together, and I know he's extremely knowledgeable, and I hope that we can draw as much as possible from him in an area, in a subject which is hardly discussed at all in Sweden. I mean, he's going to tell you what is going to happen very soon, where our Prime Minister is actually even going to be engaged. And I haven't seen one word in the newspapers in Sweden. So, Andrew, the floor is yours. And just one thing. You remember that we have, as you can see, we have big microphones here. But these microphones are for the screaming. No, not screaming. Streaming. For the streaming. There are a lot of people who are listening to this tonight. I know that, from all parts of Sweden. So welcome to them also, and that we have no microphones for you to listen. So we have to speak up loudly. But when you talk later on and you ask questions, you have also to have a microphone. So, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be in Stockholm. ECDPM, one of the longest acronyms I've ever come across, is called the European Centre for Development Policy Management. So we are an independent think, and we like to say do tank, because we do work as well. We don't just sit and think about issues. We get out, we meet people, we do research all over in Europe and in Africa. And we are based in the Netherlands, and we have a small office right next to the European institutions, but myself and my colleagues are very often traveling around Europe and also engaging with in Africa as well. Basically, one of the reasons I'm speaking to you here today is because we very much value our cooperation with Sweden. Lennart was he was very modest, but he was formerly the chair of the board of ECDPM. And he always was very good about pushing us to consider the history of development cooperation, and that many of the things that are said to be new and innovative and very different are actually things that have been tried before many times, maybe without enough reflection on perhaps why they didn't work the first time around. But what I am going to talk to you today is about the changing context of Europe-Africa relations, because I think there is a lot of change going on, and it is generally a different world that we are in, and I think many of us can feel it at home, but how is it going to affect EU-Africa relations? And the second thing I will say is, this is very much a view from Europe. We try not to be Eurocentric at ECDPM. Many of our staff are from Africa, or many of our board are from Africa, and we travel and engage a lot in the continent. But I head the European External Affairs Programme. I am a European. I am based in Maastricht. And so it's very much a view from Europe looking towards Africa. And that has its limitations, but where we are now, I think it's a useful way to look. If you have more specific questions about how Europe looks at Africa, I can give some perspectives on that, but I wouldn't claim to speak or be able to speak on that perspective. So it is a Eurocentric view. I make no apology for that. That's the way I'm choosing to do it, but it does have its limitations. Basically, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the changing nature of the overall political environment. And some of this stuff you feel and know very well. I'm then going to talk about recent policy developments. You may not have heard about them, but there are some new things going on emanating from Europe at the higher levels that will impact Europe-Africa relations. I will look at 4 key issues. There are many more issues you can choose from, and maybe Lennart will prod me to say, why haven't you chosen this issue? It's much more important. So I've just only chosen 4. And then I will look at a sort of forward-looking piece of analysis on maybe how we can change EU-Africa relations. Because as you will see, not all things are well with Europe-Africa relations at the moment. So to start off, what about the context of EU-Africa relations? What are the major things that are driving change? Well, basically, we have an existential crisis in Europe. I'm sure you're all well aware of that. Europe is in a bigger mess than it's probably been in, for many decades, and that obviously is going to shape its relations with the rest of the world. We have, the tail end of austerity, and it's still austerity in many countries. We have violent conflict coming closer to Europe's borders, so that exercises the mind in a different way. We have Mr. Trump and the Trump presidency, a threat to international liberal order, people would say. We have a migration situation. Some people classify it as a crisis. Other people say that that is a gross oversimplification and hyperbole for something that, given the numbers, is not actually big compared to many of the biggest refugee hosting countries around the world, most of which are in the south. So what all of this has led to in a certain degree in terms of EU-Africa relations is a certain risk aversion and inertia. Basically, European member states look towards the EU as a sort of cash machine that has a big pot of money for which can be used to try and solve problems that they have. And also the structural limitations of how you organize foreign policy, European foreign policy, security policy, and development policy is kind of rushing up against this really different context it's in. Yet I would also say there are opportunities for change because, as my deputy director has said, basically business as usual just won't do. And we've said that for a long time with EU-Africa relations. But now, because of the changing political environment, there is perhaps an opportunity to look at it afresh and maybe change some of the ways things have been done in the past. Maybe. Let me explain a little bit more. Okay, so what basically motivates the EU when it engages with Africa? I think there is lots of narratives going on around what the EU is trying to do in Africa, and depending on who you speak to, when you speak to them, or maybe they don't speak at all, maybe it's more of a hidden agenda, there are various interests. And we just group them into 5 areas here, and we could explore each of them in detail. But there's historical ties that certain EU countries have with Africa that still basically dictate a large part of how relations are conducted with former colonies, Europe and Africa, Francophone and Anglophone Africa. Those historical ties are still pretty strong, and they still influence the nature of EU-Africa relations overall. You also have some core foreign policy objectives that the EU is trying to achieve. Stability, access to raw materials, energy, addressing migration issues. These are sort of core foreign policy objectives of the heart, and these also are, while they're not so often talked about openly, they are very much dictating how the EU engages with Africa. You also have trade and commercial interests, economic partnership agreements, some of you may have heard of. Africa is seen as a new market, so there is interest there. And there is a whole policy arena around trade and commercial interests. And trade is a competence of the EU. For those of you who are political scientists, it means that the EU can do what it wants alone on trade because it has the authority to sign and negotiate trade agreements with the rest of the world. And then perhaps more the areas that you might be interested or more familiar with is the EU also has fundamental values. It has values based on issues such as human rights, democracy, but it also, humanitarian concern, poverty alleviation. This is all part of how the EU engages with the rest of the world and Africa. And finally, it has living up to global commitments. The EU believes in multilateralism, how we have the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, and this also feeds into the mix of how foreign and development policy is undertaken. So all of these things influence how the EU engages with Africa, and they rub up against each other, sometimes seamlessly in a very coordinated, coherent approach, and other times completely incoherently. So the EU says one thing with one arm it's doing, and then completely changes it with the other arm. It sends very mixed messages, and that incoherence is becoming more and more. And the difference between the rhetoric, which is often Europe's rhetoric towards Africa, is we want to help to lift you out of poverty. We are very concerned about the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Can we be partners on international climate change? And then yet you have historical ties, foreign policy objectives, and trade and commercial interests, which are also in the picture. And so the agenda and the real agenda is significantly more complicated than that. Just to say, I mean, what I said earlier, I mean, what we see is really changing Europe-Africa relations at the moment is instability in the neighborhood, not just in Africa, but instability and violent conflict in the neighborhood. And what that has meant is Africa no longer becomes an issue that development ministers deal with, or even foreign ministers deal with. But it's but in many countries it's an issue at the top table. So it's prime ministerial interest and Minister of the Interior interest. Sweden is slightly different on that, and you're a little bit of an outlier. But in most countries, including your Nordic, your Scandinavian cousins in Denmark, in your fellow long-term development partners like the Netherlands, it is these kind of issues that have lifted Africa higher on the agenda and have changed the narrative around how to engage with Africa, or what is the most important thing to engage with Africa. And that's a difference. That's something that hadn't happened before the current issues around migration and violent conflict. Are European citizens in this changing environment still positive about development cooperation? That's the question. I mean, often people are saying, well, we're changing the narrative on responding and engaging with Africa because it is a demand from our citizens. And as we see the rise of political parties that want to have a more hard line or a more nationalist line on things, that's why we're responding to it. Well, this is a major survey conducted by Eurobarometer that basically says that helping developing countries is still important to European citizens. And this was 1,000 people in every EU member state, apart from the smaller member states, were asked, including Sweden. And this is a composite. And 89% still talked about values. Helping development countries is important. Tackling poverty is a moral obligation. And also were relatively positive about what development assistance can achieve. Yet, other surveys have showed that there is a debate about what the EU should prioritise, or when you put development cooperation or engagement with Africa against other priorities such as engaging on terrorism or looking for internal issues, jobs in Europe, these things change a bit. But having said that, it is not the case that all Europeans think that aid should be stopped, that helping developing countries is no longer important, which is sometimes a narrative that you hear, that, you know, the world has changed, people don't want to do this anymore. Well, actually, if you ask them, most of them do. I'm going to talk about recent and forthcoming policy developments. We're a policy institute, and policies dictate how you spend money, how priorities are made, what kind of dialogue you engage with. It's not just pieces of paper. Obviously, what is said on paper in some of the policies is not nearly what is actually implemented. But there are two recent policy developments that I want to talk about because they are indicative of the changing times we find ourselves in. One is the EU now has a global strategy for foreign and security policy. This is the first time the EU actually has something like that. It used to have a European security strategy in 2003, which again came about after September the 11th, and the fact the Americans developed a new Euro strategy. But now this is a sort of comprehensive foreign development policy that also has a development component, but also talks about EU interests. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Then there's something called the European Consensus on Development, which I wonder how many of you in the room have ever heard of the European Consensus on Development. How many hands up? So there's a few. Well, actually, you're committed to it. Sweden has signed on the dotted line, foreign minister, and it doesn't just refer to the EU institutions, it refers to your own development policy. Supposedly, all EU member states, the European Parliament, the European Commission have signed up in 2017 to a new vision collectively about what their development policy will entail. How many people have heard there's an EU-Africa Heads of State Summit coming up? Aha, a few more. Okay, interesting. More people have heard that than about the European Consensus on Development. But yes, that's coming up at the end of the month. It happens once every 3 years. It's usually measured rather disappointingly from our perspective on how many heads of state turn up, not actually what comes out of it, what change or whatever. It's a rather disappointing thing. We also have Brexit negotiations. There is a long-standing agreement between, which I'll talk about in more detail, between African, Caribbean, Pacific countries and the EU that is up for revision, first time in 20 years. We have a new budget that's coming on, and we'll have a new European Commission, that means new European commissioners, and a new European Parliament in 2019. So there's a lot of change on the agenda. So the new EU global strategy, well, some people say, is this a return to realpolitik? It's, it basically says some things that are quite bold. We live in times of existential crisis within and outside the EU. Okay, we need to have principled pragmatism. So we need to be pragmatic about what our interests are and how we engage with the rest of the world. Our values don't go away, but they need to be maybe tempered a bit. A very strong security narrative. We're under threat. Europe and the EU is under threat. And also a stronger alignment between development cooperation, humanitarian action and foreign policy. These are things that need to be brought together. And while the EU retains a global ambition, it's very clear that the priority of the EU is the neighbourhood and the neighbourhood of the neighbourhood. So that's the countries that border the EU in North Africa and the East, and those countries which are directly connected to them, like, for example, the Sahel in Africa, the Sahel group of countries. The new European Consensus on Development. So basically there was an old one in 2005 and a new consensus in 2017. And basically, to make things simple, what we did is we put all the words that were in this wonderful document and we said, well, what are the ones that pop out the most? And at the top is the old consensus, and you can see words like aid and poverty are very big on this is what the European consensus was about. Where now it's about developing countries, yes, but it's about cooperation. It's obviously about Agenda 2030. Rights are also there, but it shows a shift. It's just a small tool to show a shift. And there were some tough fights over some of the wording. So basically, migration was in there in more details, but not just because migration is important for development, but because the EU has interests on migration. There was much more talk about development finance in terms of blending. And there was a very tough fight over the wording on support to security. A fight that Sweden was one of the ones who said, we have no problem with you using development money if you're talking about security sector reform in a developing country. We have a big problem if you're using development cooperation resources to build capacity of border control safeguards. That's not what development money is for. And it's not what development policy should be about. So there was some compromise in that in the end of the day. I just mentioned this briefly. There is an agreement called the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, which is basically a long-term historical agreement that dates from the late 1950s between African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, Sub-Saharan African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, all who vast majority of them were former colonies, and Europe and the EU. It's a legal agreement, although it's not really honoured as such, and it traditionally had covered development cooperation, trade, and political dialogue. But in recent years, it's really all been about aid management, and the political dialogue has gone down. The value of having a big group of countries coming together that have very diverse interests is changing. There are a few Caribbean countries, for example, that have higher GNIs than some EU member states. So there's a question there when you're about how things should be organised. And basically, this overarching framework, which is a sort of history, and the EU's first foreign relations, before it had a foreign policy, before it had an external action, it had a development policy with ACP and EU countries. There is now a question of revising this framework in because it will come to an end in 2020. And what we have been saying, and we've produced a lot of political economy analysis on this, if you're into political economy analysis, that actually this thing is no longer fit for purpose and it doesn't help constituents in Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, or in Europe. And there's also some real vested interests in not reforming it and keeping it in a similar way that it has in the past. Okay, so we have this summit. Basically, we also have a joint EU-Africa strategy, which perhaps you've not heard of, but that was in 2007, and that was pretty innovative when it came out. It talked about climate change in much more detail before, energy cooperation, peace and security, migration, and essentially back then on migration, on the negotiation of that, the African side went, you want to talk about migration? We want to talk about mobility and employment. So we're not talking about migration unless we can talk about mobility and employment, because that's what is important to us, not just migration to Europe. So essentially, it was 2007, it was new, it was innovative, but its implementation has been extremely weak and disappointing. We've also seen that EU-Africa relations, increasingly the dialogue on values has become more difficult in Europe. With Europe-Africa, also because on the African side there is increasing assertiveness of African governments. We don't want to talk about human rights and development issues. Development issues, yes, but human rights, no. You're importing your values. On the European side, the ability to take the moral high ground in dealing with certain values issues has been limited because of the response to the migration crisis, because of also closing space for civil society in some parts of Europe as much as Africa. And also because sometimes it wants to talk to African governments about refugee returns and doesn't necessarily want to talk about human rights issues at the same time. Or doesn't want to broach more difficult issues in case they cause more problems in EU-Africa relations or create more issues that they think will affect stability on the continent. Africa increasingly has other partners. You can't really see the cartoon here. This is basically, Europeans saying, "Oh, Africa, I think I've missed a big opportunity," and it's supposed to be Africa and China saying, to getting married. I was always worried about, well, how politically correct is that cartoon? And when I showed it at a meeting in Cape Verde with African think tanks, they were like, no, this is all wrong. It should be a polygamous relationship in which the African bride can marry, can get the best deal possible with multiple different partners to get the best deal possible. That would be and it was not the response I was expecting at all, but it was a response I got, and that actually by having more partners, your ability to get a better deal is better. So actually, from many African perspectives, having more choice in partners to deal with, China, India, the Gulf countries, Turkey, who offer a different form of cooperation, is a very welcome development on the continent. We have an agenda for the summit which is about youth, which in some ways is great. It's about the next generation. It's about the future. It's about looking to change things with people who are going to be the change agents of the future. Having said that, it's also there because it was a safe topic. It was a topic that the political sides on both sides, or actually it wasn't the political side, the officials, the senior officials went, how can we find a topic that's not going to be controversial, that's not going to be difficult, that both sides are going to agree to, and that we can all meet on? So that's part of the problem with EU-Africa relations, is they don't talk about the more difficult issues, either on Europe's side or on Africa's side. So the problem is both sides. I want to make that clear. So key issues ahead. Well, one of them is that from a European perspective, migration and security are dominating the narrative from Europe, both in a lot of the press in Europe, in the Prime Minister's agenda. You know, wouldn't it be great if European Prime Ministers were focused on how do we realize the SDG agenda in Africa and how do we support that and support it at home? It would be great, but it's not. It's about migration and security. The EU has created emergency trust funds for Africa. These are large pots of money that are, well, large, billions, to spend money more quickly on migration-related issues. And this was because this is highly unusual, unprecedented, but because of the political imperative for the EU to be seen to be doing something, it was done. In doing so, there are a lot of questions about whether old principles of development cooperation that, Lennart, you spend your life defending on ownership, consultation, all the entire Accra Action Agenda and Paris Agenda on aid effectiveness have been kind of swept out of the way in the desire to do things fast, do things quick. Something must be done. There's also migration compacts with certain countries. These are slightly opaque agreements in which, okay, we may give you more resources if you do certain things related to migration, and even potentially less resources if you don't. And that's again would seem to, not so much learning from the past about what conditionalities can and can't do. Brexit. Okay, you probably noticed I'm from the UK. I'm actually from Scotland. I have to say that very clearly, where the perspective is slightly different on EU-Africa on Brexit. But that's going to have an impact. As I said at the start, colonial ties are there, which are not always positive, often negative. But also the UK had many positive aspects to it as well in its engagement with Africa through the EU and with the EU. So you're going to potentially have increased foreign policy and donor fragmentation if the EU does something else. Financial resources going through the EU, it's impossible to tell how much less it will be. Cuts, basically, the estimates from 12 to 15%. Also, the EU leaving, one of the things that, again, one of my African colleagues said was, well, the money is not so important, but the idea that integration and regional integration isn't something positive, it isn't something you should be a part of. The normative impact that you have, the donors are often, or countries in Europe are often saying to African countries, oh, you need to integrate more, you need to have better regional integration, you're not trading enough with yourselves, you're not integrated enough. And then they say, well, yeah, but basically the UK is leaving the EU, so this is going in the wrong direction. Why should we do that? And why is that always a good thing? The UK has good expertise on development cooperation. It may often be arrogant about it. It may often be, think of itself as the best people to do development issues. But their knowledge network, their access has generally been respected. And actually, Sweden and the UK have often made common cause on development issues in many forums, including through the EU. And there's a real worry in Sweden now when we talk to the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What happens without the UK on these issues? There is a space left in EU-Africa policy. Who will fill it? Will France be more powerful? Will the European Commission be more powerful? Germany has more of an strategic interest in Europe. Or will it be a group of others? Will Sweden and a group of other like-minded countries look to fill that gap? Will we see a shift in geographic priorities? The sense the UK had an influence to switch to focus the EU on the Horn of Africa, and Eastern Africa, to a lesser extent Southern Africa. Now will you see more of the EU's focus on Francophone Africa and the Sahel, because that's where more strategic interest. I don't quite know, but that's potentially one thing. Also, all of the UK government, and we talk to them quite a lot, are consumed by Brexit and are completely they are unable to act very coherently or get political interest on other dossiers, including on Africa at the moment. And so that's really a problem for Europe and the UK. Yet, again, I have colleagues, particularly Southern African colleagues at ECDPM, who say, well, maybe we can get some better trade deals. I've just been speaking to the citrus producers of Southern Africa, South Africa, and they think, well, basically, the Southern Europeans protect the British market from us. We see an opportunity here. Can we potentially get a better trade deal with the UK for our citrus producers, wine, whatever? It tends to be the more middle income, it tends to be countries like South Africa who see an opportunity in this. Again, to go back to the polygynous relationship, can Africa, again, get a better deal because it's got the UK to deal with and the EU to deal with on certain things. It's very unclear where this Brexit process will end. The UK came out with a policy paper 2 months ago on how it will cooperate on defence, foreign policy and development. And I was speaking to someone from the British Development Ministry last week, and I said, that policy paper from 2 weeks ago, it's quite interesting. He said, no, that's done. That's out of date now. It's it's a different narrative now. Things are moving so fast that you can't even keep up with it. And some of these things will only be decided at the last minute and the political level. And you may have development issues being thrown onto the table or taken off the table at the last minutes in the negotiations. For example, the UK may say, well, we'll pay into a future development fund because we have to pay something into the budget for market access, and that's something we throw on. But it won't be about development. It'll be about things that will be put on the table or taken off at the last minute. It'll be about Brexit and EU-UK relations. I know I spoke too long, so I'll whip through this fairly quickly. So there is a new external investment plan with billions in it, 1 or 2, called the European Fund for Sustainable Development, that tries to do something different with development finance. Again, it's on one level it's quite positive to try and have blending of increase the amount of financial resources going to Africa to help investment. It's quite similar to an internal European investment plan that Europe has inside Europe. It enjoys high-level political sponsorship. It's supposed to reflect on the lessons and add value to what other investment banks are doing to strengthen eligibility and sustainability criteria. It's to link to the local context. There's a lot of warm words, but still there's concerns about additionality, added value, competence of the EU. Is this a signal to move away from grant aid? And now we move to something else overall. And also the workability in fragile contexts. And again, as we are a think tank and we engage with African actors, they say, well, this is great, but could you not come and talk to us about it sooner? Because this is yet again, isn't it, Europe coming up with a plan for Africa, or a plan that is not sufficiently consulted and brought in at an earlier stage. The next budget. Mariella here is the expert on the budget, and if you have basically, the overall EU budget is about 1 trillion, which sounds a lot, but it's less than 1% of EU GNI. The Swedish government position is to make sure it doesn't grow a penny or a cent. Basically, the international, the external spending is about 6.1% plus 30 billion from the European Development Fund, which by an anomaly is outside the budget but negotiated at the same time. If you have a particular interest in that, I can talk to you about it. These negotiations, MFF is called the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, will have a huge impact on the priorities and institutional setup of the EU in all domains. So it's a big opportunity for change. It comes along once every 7 years. Often the form follows the money. So basically the way the EU is set up, the priorities it's set up will be done on that. The EU has various streams of money that provide legal basis. basically how to rationalize these. There are a number that are relevant to Africa, but they're fairly scattered. Also, this big battle on European values and its external and security interests, how will they impact? Will we see more money for security cooperation and less money for overseas development assistance from Europe in the future or not? Will these bigger concerns, will they create a special fund for migration, for example? Will they change the nature of how things are done? This would be the opportunity to do that. And certainly there's a feeling that the migration situation, I refuse to call it a crisis, has really stretched and stressed the EU budget, and they've had to do a lot of things sort of ad hoc and that they want to do it a bit more creatively and a bit more solidly in the future. Okay, potential ways forward. We have an analysis that's coming out. It's not out yet, and I will just run you through some of the lines. Given that's the context, and I didn't talk so much about what is going on in Africa, which is also part of our analysis. But basically, how can you change the way that Europe and Africa deal with each other, and maybe address some of the difficult issues between it? Well, we have a sort of five areas, and they're not alone. They have to be taken as a whole. So essentially, we think that Europe and Africa need to put their interests more up front. And this may sound counterintuitive to say, oh, well, if you put your interests up front, where are the values in this? Our thinking is, well, the interests have always been there, but they've often been hidden or they've been pursued through other means, and actually a bit more honesty and upfrontness about what commercial, strategic, security interests or commercial interests on both sides are had, bringing that much more into the debate, being more honest about that, will serve EU-Africa relations better than continuing how it's been done in the past. There's also a need to facilitate the consolidation of African agendas, and that is really, often Europe comes to these summits with very well thought out agendas that have been negotiated by the EU over years, if not months, beforehand. The African Union is a younger institution with less competencies, less powers than the European EU, and also Africa often feels that Europe is imposing its agenda and saying, own this. This should be your agenda on migration control. This should be your agenda on regional integration. This should be your agenda on trade relations. The facilitation or allowance of space of those African-owned agendas that don't just mean official parties, it also means civil society and other actors. And there are ways that the Europe can facilitate that. And responding and engaging with those would make the cooperation easier. For example, there is something called Africa Peace and Security Architecture that is an Africa-owned and articulated overall architecture behind peace and security on the agenda, on the continent. And Europe, for the most part, apart from a few notable instances, has tried to align and support that. And that has been very positive because they've aligned and tried to support that. Now, there's always examples on certain coups, certain foreign policy interests, what happened in Libya, where it didn't, and that caused more problems. But there was an agenda, it was laid out, it was the African agenda, the primacy of the African Union and the governance structure of the African Union were behind that, and that has really helped the cooperation if Europe is seen as aligning behind that. And if they're not, Africa and various African parties say, you're not, you signed up to this, you're not aligned behind it. In other areas of policy, it's much less clear. Also, Europe-Africa relations has often been focused on the official parties, the EU-Africa Heads of State Summit, the Commission-to-Commission dialogue, Africa Union Commission, European Commission, when actually there's a lot going on, people to people, there's a lot going on, entrepreneurs to entrepreneurs on the continent, youth to youth, diaspora relations. There is a lot more that has more freshness, more interest, more real dynamism than some of the official negotiations, some of the official bodies and official forums. How can you unleash these more and bring these more into changing the way that Europe and Africa relates to each other? The other is basically being diversified and saying, okay, just because we've got a big problem in one particular policy area, we shouldn't be stuck in other areas if they're more promising. So, maybe there are things in part of the climate change dialogue that we can find common positions on, and maybe there are things we can't. Let's talk about what we might be able to do together And let's look for things that results orientated. I know I'm quite critical of the results agenda, but things that produce something out of it rather than talking chops, because a lot of these forums on EU Africa, they seem to exist because they exist, not because they get results out of it. So people like to fly and stay in a hotel and talk, lofty ideals about how Europe and Africa can have better relations on human rights without actually anything coming from them. And then finally, it's rationalising the policy frameworks for Africa. I talked about the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific EU relation. There is a joint EU-Africa strategy. There is a engagement in North Africa. There are different funding streams that overlap. And if you rationalise these, then you would have a better way of engaging in the relationship. So we think if you could make progress on some of these, it may be a way out a little bit of it. Lennart, I've spoke too long. Mariella is here for questions related to the EU budget, not just in relation to Africa, but more generally related to external affairs and ODA and maybe how the EU is collaborating with middle-income countries. But thank you very much, and I'm at your disposal to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was long, but still there are a lot of issues that you did bring up and didn't go deep enough into. And the question is how deep we can go into some of these issues. But I still think at least some of them have to come on the floor. Okay. And we also will ask Mariella to say something before we leave the questions open. You haven't mentioned trade. And trade has been, and I know that it's not your turf. I saw that ECDPM is next week actually going to come out with a new great insight on trade. And ECDPM has been very engaged as a sort of dialogue partner between Africa and EU in the negotiations on trade. And they have been long and very, very complicated, and they are still not solved, as far as I understand. Just a few words about this. Okay. The second point, you mentioned it, but I don't think really it came up. I mean, the self-interest of Europe would, of course, in a world where where raw material is going to be more and more difficult to get to find, and Africa is one of the major sources for raw material. So the self-interest would be to have a good relation with Africa, in a way that China is doing. I mean, when China acts, they are very clear on their interests. Mm-hmm. They negotiate. They call it mutual benefit. We don't call it. I mean, I guess that we are very interested in the raw materials, but we still act as we sort of enforce our policies on Africa. Can you just give a few words on the sort of what are really the negotiation principles of Europe when we put our self-interest in such a bad way compared with others who fight for the same? We all fight for the African raw materials. Just a few words on these two issues. Okay. If you can be short.
Yeah. No, I will be.
No, it's not easy.
Yeah. On trade, I'm going to have to dodge the bullet on that, because we're basically, it's not my colleagues are a lot more knowledgeable, and we have in 2 weeks this detailed aspect of it. It hasn't been on the agenda of previous summits, and it won't be on the agenda of this summit because they feel we have other forums to deal with it. So there is the Economic Partnership Agreement, trade, those forums to deal with it. So it is one of the most longest running issues, but also the problem is the African Union Commission doesn't really have the authority on trade issues. So on trade, it's perhaps the longest running issue of controversy between the two continents. And Europe always says, well, we're trying to help. It's development friendly trade agreements that we're offering. That's not how the majority of Africa stakeholders see it. But I don't see the summit actually having any new breakthrough on trade. The interesting thing is whether Brexit will change the EU's position, because our advice to African countries is basically take your current EU agreement and go, okay, this is our current EU agreement. You've got to do better than this. It's got to be better than what you know. This is the minimum, and you've got to do better, and then we can talk. And if it's not better, we're not talking. And whether that will change the dynamics a little bit, I don't know. But it also depends on how the EU UK trade relationship is in the future as well. So on trade, I say go to our website, look at what my colleagues say, because it's a complex dossier. On raw materials, this is where, if we go back to this is where some of the challenges are. So basically there is interest in raw materials and energy. Are you willing to say, okay, because we're interested in raw materials and interested in energy, we actually don't think these fundamental values are actually so important anymore to get access to those? Because that's what, do you do that? I mean, it's not, and that's a bit of a stark case. I mean, also what we know on raw materials and the EU is that the EU has delegations in in pretty much every African country. So the head of delegation is sent in at 12 o'clock to give a strong message on human rights in the upcoming election. So at 12 o'clock, the EU ambassador goes in and delivers a message which is not usually very well received on human rights and say upcoming elections. At 2 o'clock, an EU member states ambassador accompanied by a company go in and talk about access to raw materials. Now, what does that do? Well, basically, the EU ambassador has to deliver the message on human rights, while the EU member state gets the relationship on raw materials that they want, and they can disaggregate those two. So it's often that kind of game is played where the EU family is not coherent, and it's often the EU head of delegation that gets to deliver the tough messages on human rights, while the commercial interests or the core foreign policy interests are driven by the member states and their commercial interests in the country. But it's also about building a better dialogue and a more honest dialogue. As I said, on raw materials, it's like, yeah, we would like your raw materials, making sure that not even the communique coming from the summit, for example, is it all going to be about how important the 2030 agenda is, how we both subscribe to it, how we really want to do it? If that's it, then it's very much based on fundamental values, and it's not being honest about the EU having more commercial interests and raw material interests. So I think some honesty doesn't mean to say you throw your values out the window, but it would help, because that's often what we hear from African member states and African officials is we're very, very interested in doing business, but this preaching values to us that you are not upholding yourself as Europeans is problematic.
Okay, you talked a lot about migration, but I think we all are interested to hear a little more what it means in practice. I mean, what is actually, and you wrote about it, so you know quite well, what is actually happening in practice now? How is these issues driven? You said that there is a incoherence with the ownership and.
Yeah. So what the EU did was it created, in terms of, there's various policy responses it did. So there was a Valletta summit. So there was a summit in Valletta in Malta, which wasn't part of this round of summits, and some people were invited to and other people weren't. It was a summit that wasn't organised jointly. It was a bilateral summit in which Europe invited certain African parties and then forgot to invite certain regional organisations, in which an agenda was laid out to deal with migration. So that's one thing that's happened. And there's mixed views on whether that was a success or not. The other thing that's increasingly happening is migration has gone way up the agenda of development cooperation in most countries. So most countries, Sweden is again an outlier in this. Migration is one of the thematic issues that are important. To give you another example, a concrete example, new Dutch government coming in has new priority countries for development cooperation. Can anyone guess where these countries might be? 3 new priority countries for Dutch development cooperation. Jordan, Libya, Syria and Lebanon are the 3 countries. So people are also shifting their priorities, not only the Commission and the Member States, to those, because there is and that's also was part of the coalition agreement in the Netherlands, because some of the parties that got into power once said, okay, you can keep your development assistance level at the same level, but you need to focus on these countries. So there is a concern that in the future, and it is already happening, that essentially some of the money for EU trust funds was taken from money that was going to go for regional integration in Africa. And it hadn't been spent yet, so they took that money and they put it in the trust fund on migration. Concretely, what happened in the first round so the EU created a new trust fund on Africa that focused on migration. In the first round of that, basically, because the development business is quite clever, they dusted down all their old proposals they had in the drawers and changed a few words, and like food security to deal with migration, but NGOs, implementing agencies, UN agencies, and basically did similar things that they'd done in the past with a slight migration. And they got, in the first round, they got quite a lot of resources. What we feel is happening, we don't have the data yet to prove it, what we feel is happening now is, rather than going for more funding that was more sort of resilience or peace building, more generally, the second round is much more about migration governance. So it's much more about how does your work and the criteria for assessing and the criteria for projects being financed out of this is much more about migration control, migration governance related issues, rather than migration and development or addressing structural issues that may or may not relate to conflict and migration. So that's tangibly what potentially is happening. We need to do more research to see whether that is just an impression or whether that really is the case. And certainly, not in Sweden, but in most other European countries and in Europe, in the EU institutions, when people talk about Africa, it's often, what are you doing on migration? Now, if you talk to senior people at the EU institutions, they say, yes, but this is still only, even if these trust funds were spending all their money on migration governance, this is still, 2%, 1.5% of our overall ODA. We're just retasking a small portion of it to migration issues. So, don't judge us just on that. This is to give the impression that all of aid is being securitized and migration governance is completely false in their perspective. But it certainly is a trend, and it's a growing trend. And the other concern we have is very much, if you are trying to negotiate migration compacts, and again I'll give you, there's a very big country in Africa. You can probably guess which one it is, but it's a very big country in Africa that has been a development darling for a long time, that has major human rights issues going on in that country. The message we hear from the EU is, we would like to raise these fundamental values, issues and human rights and whatever, but we're very concerned that if something happens in this country and there is a civil conflict, we will get a big flow of migration. And our primary aim and the message from our political masters is stability, which means the regime in itself needs to be backed and supported. And so therefore, these difficult issues are not raised and the money comes. So that's a concrete, we have to be a bit careful on how we say these things if we're live streaming, but that's a concrete example of some of the things that are going on.
Okay, very interesting. I think one issue, we can't talk very much more about it, but still it has to be underlined, and perhaps you can just tell us a little about, because this is a high controversy within EU itself, and that is the negotiations on PostCanto. Because, I mean, you have talked about it as a technical issue, but it is actually much more a political...
I mean, it's quite a technical, it is a political issue, quite a technical issue, but maybe I can come to that one I'll come back to that when other people, because I think I mean, I can do it quickly, but it's quite technical to be political. So essentially there's this agreement, I said, between these 78 ACP countries and the EU. There are those who say, well, can't we really change this? The world has changed since this was originally set up, and we need to have a much more regional or global agreements with developing countries, or other regional groupings like Africa, the Caribbean, Pacific separately, rather than having them all together. The Commission has, and again this is to go back to European Commission, I think risk aversion and inertia has basically said, well, let's keep this ACP EU construct broadly the same as we've done in the past, because there is a group of countries, we have a relationship with them, and certainly African, Caribbean, Pacific ambassadors in Brussels also would like that, because the ACP gives them particular status, because it is a club which they're all part of. It is something in which they are together on. So there are certain, I would call them vested interests for keeping the status quo. And there is a certain concern that, well, if we try and start with a blank sheet or try and start with EU-Africa again, are we going to get this agreement signed in the future? It's always easier to build on something that's been done in the past. So there hasn't been a more radical thinking about how, either on the EU side or in the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific, and essentially it was even to be kept off the agenda of the AU-EU summit, because basically the European negotiating position wasn't ready yet, or the European Commission didn't want to publish it yet. So it's again, it seems like a huge missed opportunity. If you have all these heads of states from Europe and Africa together to really think about the future of your relationship, and you're just going to negotiate a new 20-year agreement after that, why not try and put it on the agenda and talk about it, however difficult it is, because there are values in there, because there are, why not put it on that agenda and get it discussed? And so it's a very political issue on how to actually do it. And there is some latest echoes that it may creep onto the agenda, but it was planned not to be.
Okay, that takes us to this the meeting that is going to take place the 27th of
Yes.
November. And actually Löfven is going to be there, so Sweden is going to be well represented.
Yeah.
I heard that, and perhaps someone is here to confirm it from the ministry, and anyway, I think perhaps just a few comments on in comparison with how other parts of the world deals in relation to Africa. And I said China before, but there are many others who have these biannual or annual meetings, and they are usually on a high political level. Europe has been seen as being very arrogant, because many African heads of states are coming to these meetings, and it's for at least for Sweden, it was said before that this was sort of a development cooperation issue, and they sent the cooperation minister. Do you see that this is taken more seriously now? Does it seem to be important for Europe, these kind of meetings?
Well, I mean, is it important? Well, it is a moment for Europe and Africa relations to get to the top level of people, but there is a question of who really wants this summit, both in Africa and in Europe. Is it something that we have to do every 3 years because we have to do it every 3 years, or is it something we want to do because we've got something to talk about? And on the European side, I mean, and this goes right back to summits. The first one was in 2000, whereby what to put on the agenda, what to not put on the agenda. And in the past, Africa has put on things like debt relief on the agenda in 2000. We really want to talk about debt relief. If you talk to the people at the EU who organise summits, they go, this is the only summit where aid is on the agenda. Every other summit the EU has, it's really a meeting in which we talk about things to basically things we're stuck on, like steel tariffs or something. So we have an issue with China or China or the US on steel tariffs, and that's why we need the top level political. The homework is done, and we break through that by having everyone in the same place. in EU Africa, I mean, it's unwieldy because there's so many different heads of state. Different countries send different levels of representation. What's really on the agenda? There is sometimes an expectation on the African side that this is a pledging summit. Europe is always desperately keen to say, no, it's not, it's a dialogue, we want the political dialogue. But then if some of the most important issues are evacuated from the agenda, what can you really expect? And as I said at the start, my fear is that this one moment you get every 3 years is going to be judged on who turned up, not what the outcome is. In the past, they've had action plans coming out of it. So we have an action plan and we follow. They had an action plan coming out of the last summit, but there was no official evaluation of it and no real official commentary on it before this summit. Why? Because there wasn't very much to tell. So that's my concern. I think there may well be a higher level of European turnout to the summit, but I think it goes back to, because maybe there is expectations on the bilateral level because security and migration is higher on the agenda, not because there wants to be a more grown-up dialogue between Europe and Africa. So those are my fears.
Okay, let's just take up the budget also. I mean, there is, as you said, it's.
Do you think more people want to?
Yeah. It's my final question.
Yeah.
We have another half.
I'm feeling very guilty for speaking too long.
Yeah, but you should. That's why you're here. No, but now I turn to you. And the question is really, I mean, this is part of the 7-year Europe budget, EU budget, and it's a very small part. Which we are talking about when we talk about development cooperation and also these issues around development cooperation. Is it going to be really? I mean, you are talking about the details now, and that's what you are here for. I understand. You talk to the ministry today or tomorrow. Sure. So the question is really: is this really going to be an important discussion? Are these issues really brought up? On a level then and really discussed thoroughly, or is this just passed by with all the rest and other issues are more important? And the second one is, of course, what will Brexit mean for the upcoming budget? Yeah. But please come up here and.
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of words because I don't know how. Sort of the level of knowledge in the room. So just to say, the budget we are talking about now is the budget after 2020. So the European Union is starting negotiations now for the budget that will come after the one that is going now on expires. Is it a big moment for Africa? I think overall the MFF, I think two considerations. One consideration is that it is a very Europe-centric sort of process and event in which actually African stakeholders engage relatively little because it's very complex. It happens all in Brussels, so it doesn't really go or rarely really goes beyond the delegations. So actually the space for engagement has been very, very limited historically, I think, and also because it's a very complex process. But the other consideration is it a moment of change? In some ways, it can be a moment for change, just because it's a very big negotiations in which all the parties in Europe are involved. So you have member states, you have the parliament, you have the European Commission, and all the political energies go beyond the discussion of what to do with the budget, of which definitely a small part is for not just development cooperation, but actually foreign relations and development cooperation, which is called the heading 4. Today is called the Global Europe, and it's about, it's not a big pot of money, it's 6% of the budget, so we are looking at something around, I think, including the F9, 90 billion of euros.
90 billion over 7 years.
Over 7 years. So, but there are some issues that are important for Africa. I think, first of all, the political energy in external relations today in the EU is very much around the neighborhood and the neighborhood of the neighborhood. If you read the global strategy, what it says, we look at it, we want a global strategy, but then where our regional priorities are, it's up to Central Africa and going towards Asia and Central Asia. So this is what he says. So in some ways, the geographical definition is actually pretty narrow for a global player, which is not, I don't think it's very good for Europe as an international actor, but it could actually be pretty good for Africa in the sense that what you can get today, probably you would have not get, in the previous budget negotiations, and who knows about the next. What's in it for them? I think we will discuss some of this tomorrow with the ministry. I think one of these is the interest and values thing. So what's the balance, depending on which stakeholders we look in Africa, because we have official stakeholders, but we also have civil society, what sort of agendas these different sort of organizations bring and what do they really care about. Going to the example of China, because I worked on South cooperation for a very long time. And I think a few years ago, South cooperation was seen as a bit of a magic bullet. The new kids on the block, they are going to change the dynamics. When you speak with some stakeholders today, they will say, of course, we very much appreciated the speed of operation from especially China, the fact that there is no string attached. When you speak with others, they actually say, well, actually, we would like to have more conditionality because some of the agendas that we really care about around human rights and democracy have actually lost traction because of this variety of actors that are involved today in development cooperation. So again, what sort of player Europe can actually be in terms of being more explicit about its interests, but also being very aware of what sort of impact it has on specific agendas that it cares about. And I think in Africa this is, especially if you look in North Africa, this is a very important issue. And this will be defined to a certain extent, not necessarily through the instruments that are going to be defined in the budget, but more at the programming level and at the level at which the different financial instruments that the European Union uses will be implemented. I think the other big discussion is today around what's the role of ODA and what's the role of other resources in development, and what's probably the attached to this is what's the role of financial instruments in a context where the complexity of the issues we deal with is extremely high. So on the, I think it's, and here I think we need to be a little more granular. So if we look at aid, for example, we need to consider that some countries in Africa are not all the same. So of course there are, if we look at least developed countries, we know that they are fragile context. We know that these will be countries which would be potentially heavily affected by changes in the way aid is allocated and used. While we look at countries which are more resilient, are more middle income countries, of course they have a wider set of interests and mechanisms like European Investment Plan and blending could work. But all these issues will be discussed in the budget, and they will go beyond in terms of what sort of instruments will be used, but also how the instruments will be planned and how they will be implemented. And some of these issues will be discussed in much detail during the MFF negotiations.
MFF means multi-annual financial framework.
And it's basically the nasty word for EU budget.
EU budget.
Okay, now the world is free and I'll go around with this. Remember that you have to talk into this. So, who wants to throw the first question?
First row.
We'll take a few questions, so please take note.
Can I grab
yes,
from my, where did I put my thing as a piece of paper? I can grab it from here.
please.
Yeah, so I was curious to know for this upcoming meeting and also for the EU-Africa relations in general, seeing as a few of Africa's kind of powerhouses isn't really going that well with South Africa, Kenya, or its difficult political development, that how does that affect equal partnership when so many countries in Africa have so great domestic problems to deal with? So how does that affect their foreign policy?
Yes, more questions?
Hi, my name is Malin Brenk. I'm the regional manager for Kvinna till Kvinna, an organization focusing on women's rights in conflict-affected areas. And it was very interesting to hear the focus on European trends and interests. But of course, as you said, starting off, there are a lot of trends going on in Africa. One of them that we've seen that is quite disturbing is the shrinking space for civil society. I think the latest case is Kenya, where we see it's rapidly shrinking. And that, together with what you spoke about, how the European values end of things are sort of toned down compared to their real financial interests, is of course very problematic. Not the least also because Sweden normally doesn't want to speak out on its own anymore, but more with the voice of the EU. And I'm thinking when the EU doesn't have a voice, then what are we left with? So I guess my question would be, do you see any ongoing processes at the EU level where these kind of concerns would come back on the agenda, where we can feed into discussions around human rights, democracy and other, where we really see steps being taken backwards, steps backwards? So, thank you.
Should we go and breathe?
Thank you very much. It has been most interesting to listen to and to have an overview of the present EU-Africa relationship. Seems to be very complicated, and you, I mean, still the historic heritage is there, the colonial past and all that, and it's still, I think, very important. And will that come up again more complicated with the Brexit? And the ACP and Brexit must also be complicated, because I remember the background to ACP was that the French wanted us to help them with their colonies, and the Brits also. so and now will they? How interested will France be in keeping on the British colonies in the ACP and so on? Now, that's a rude question, but these things, these feelings, I guess they are there. And then you didn't mention the Commonwealth. I've heard something that UK is actually now putting more emphasis on the Commonwealth again. And how will that affect the EU-Africa relationship? EU as a soft power and role model, has that eroded totally, or is it still there?
Okay, thank you very much. I think this gives you a lot of questions.
How long do you have?
Now we are back to what you said originally that you are not going to talk about, but I think you have to see it from the other side now, from the African side, and you do a lot of work on that also at ECDPM. So please.
I can probably do the one on. It's interesting, both in Africa and Europe, when you have troubles at home, you then relate that to your foreign policy and how you engage with the rest of the world. So I think on some of these issues, like Kenya, you have one part of saying we don't want foreign engagement, stay out, another part saying, we absolutely need the international community as the only one who can arbitrate that. But generally we see a trend, and this links to the next question on civil society, whereby countries in difficulties do not want international engagements. They want to try and solve them on their own. Or governments, governments want to try and solve them on their own, and are less open and amenable and care less perhaps than in the past for what the international community does and says. On the shrinking space for civil society, I think this is absolutely a crucial issue, and it would be, I think it needs engagement from civil society to do that. I think the European Parliament is a place whereby you have many people willing to listen to that perspective, and the European Parliament will be a negotiating party in the next EU budget, and I think you need you need to protect. I don't think it's in danger, but for example, the EU has several funding mechanisms in which, in the spirit of the ACRA action agenda, they have to be negotiated with the government, and then it has some smaller ones that don't have to be negotiated with the government. So, and there shouldn't be any erosion of that. They need both, but there certainly shouldn't be, given where civil society is, there shouldn't be an erosion for some of these mechanisms. The EU finds it very difficult because of its own financial regulations, which actually are enforced by member states, to fund civil society political movements rapidly and flexibly, which is a weakness. And some of that weakness is compensated by member states' resources at country level. And then the other thing that the EU has built its capacity on in the last few years, but needs to do a lot better, is having at delegations political officers who don't just sit and write reports, but get out and meet opposition leaders, newspapers, civil society more generally, to give a real picture of what is going on in the country. And I think that needs to be, more political reporting that the EU needs to be involved in too, so that people get a picture of what is going on. And that I think is something that needs to be more invested on by the EU institutions, is that sort of outreach and engagement at the country level through the delegations to discover, find out, and support those things. And also, I mean, the other thing, which, having done quite a lot of work on mediation, the EU heads of delegation often, who are the ambassadors in the country, often have a big role in mediation or dialogue that's informal. That appears nowhere. No press reports, nothing. But often it's them who get on the phone and say, look, if you want that budget support, those guys have got to get out of jail tomorrow. You cannot lock them up. That actually happens a lot more than anyone knows, and you can't talk about it. You can't put it in the agenda. You can't give someone, and you only get it when we do this research. It's people who are sort of left they're out of the institutions they left 5 years ago, and they can talk freely about those things, or a little bit freely, but even then they're a bit careful. And that would be a great shame if that stops happening, particularly if the US, which seems to be very absent from the human rights scene at the moment, just look at the recent trip to Asia. If you don't have the Europeans, either European ambassadors or the EU heads of delegation, standing up for these issues, then who do you have from the international community? So I think there's a necessity to fight to make that case, but there's also a necessity to link it back to European citizens, because some of this cue is being taken from, well, our political populations in our countries want something to be done about migration. They don't want more instability. They don't want more conflict in the neighbourhood. And therefore, we're taking our political cue from them. So, by the way, EU ambassadors, hold back on that human rights dialogue right now, because what we want is stability. If you can challenge and say, well, actually, is that really what European citizens want? And show that that's the case. Because I think it's going to take more than the NGO community or the foreign affairs community saying, no, this is the right thing to do. I think we've passed that political point where it requires something more to change the behaviour and change the political stakes at hand and change the dominant narrative. It's more, it can't be just the NGO community and traditional networks of NGOs and development NGOs saying this message. It has to come much more strongly. Mm.
On the Brexit.
On the Brexit.
And the colonial past.
Yeah, that is a question. I mean, basically we had a British development secretary who was just sacked from her job, but she was actually in Uganda, and she was in Uganda with the trade minister, the new trade minister, Britain didn't have a trade minister because nobody has trade ministers, because full ministers, because the EU has competence on trade policy. So, will Britain be looking for deals on trade? Will it be looking to get a better deal? Will you have a francophone anglophone split again, or exacerbated by Brexit? I'm not sure. And I mean, the one area where The UK says we really want to continue to engage the EU. There are two regions that they say in their policy paper that may be a bit out of date. And one is the Horn of Africa, because they believe they need the EU's support in the Horn of Africa. And one is the Sahel, because they need the network and the knowledge that they have there. So I'm not sure if the EU and the UK will diverge significantly. And in the past I've seen more divergence between the rest of the EU and France on particular human rights issues and particular governance issues in Africa. So I'm not sure. The UK obviously has this global Britain narrative, of which the British Commonwealth is part of, and we need to remake those relationships and have them better. Well, I'm not convinced, and I don't think many countries are, about whether that really will be something new. But certainly on the ACP, actually the UK was one of the most sceptical countries about the future of ACP EU before Brexit, and that also came from a narrative by which Britain wanted to target its aid on the least developed countries and Africa and more. I do think there's an issue of what happens with the Caribbean, which mostly middle-income countries, but as the recent hurricanes have shown, are still incredibly vulnerable. And Britain was always always supporter of their engagement in the EU. Africa will not go off the EU agenda, but will the Caribbean be less? So it may be the Caribbean that's impacted more than Africa. But I think it's a bit difficult. We can't really tell what's going to happen, and it also will depend on the Brexit negotiation. Will the UK leave the EU but seek the closest possible association by not being a member, or will it leave and say, okay, we want to define ourselves by being different, by making a different offer to the rest of the world than Europe does? Then you have to differentiate yourself, and then you may have a whole range of issues. Or do you say, well, no, we need to be as close as possible to EU and Europe positions on things?
Okay, a few more questions, and then we'll round off. Bertil?
My name is Bertil Odén. One important difference between now and when the Cotonou negotiations started is that this time EU and the Commission is on the defensive. And earlier, at starting the Cotonou, it was the other way around, more or less. And therefore I would be interested in, is there some work going on within the Commission or somewhere on an EU strategy on China in Africa? And you see what I mean, also the other countries, but how do we do it? I mean, when from the EU side you start, there is more focus also on blending. I can see that as a matching of the Chinese way of not having ODA as some sort of some obstacle when it comes to various ways of funding and providing funding. How and that is one question. The second one is on which Lennart mentioned earlier on. Is this how much do you think now that the AU or the African side here, how interested are they in a new agreement of the same, more or less, in the same type as the Cotonou? Thank you.
Some more? Yes?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tid. I just wanted you to ask between the values that you were talking about, such as democracy and so on, with the interest conflict, I mean, the raw material If we take an example, it could be Kenya, it could be Burundi. That's the recent country that went out from the ICC. Yeah, but at the same time, they make some agreement with European companies that were interested with the raw material. So what is the EU strategy to...
EU or the AU?
The EU, yeah. Mm. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question. Okay. These are the two last questions then. And then you can round off, perhaps, if you want to say something also.
Yeah, probably I can take the one on.
Yeah, but do that first then.
I can also do that, but
Okay.
I can
Start
Yeah.
you start.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, probably you can do what the EU is doing for
Yeah.
China. It's interesting. I have to say, I've been in many meetings recently on the MFF, on European foreign policy, on development cooperation, and there is always somebody asking a question on China. It's very interesting. And I can understand where this concern comes from, but in some ways, I'm not sure how evidence-based this is. Of course, the world is changing, and of course there are massive political and economic dynamics going on, and definitely this is a relevant question. Although I'm not sure to what extent. I have to be honest. It's definitely probably more of a preoccupation on how we see China rather than how China sees itself. So sometimes it's a question that I have there. It's definitely one player that plays anyway with very, very different rules. And of course, the way they see development cooperation and the role internationally is very different from ours. It goes from the definition of what aid is, but it also goes to the approach that they have to human rights. It is a completely different story. Now, I think there are opportunities there are obviously risks for the development world overall in terms of what sort of agendas we can actually push forward and which would impact. So, for example, if we look at the values agenda, that one is today much more difficult to operationalize because there are many more players through which countries can actually choose who they want to make business with. But there are also opportunities. So if we look into a more interest-driven world and if we think this is a good way to look at things, probably there are actually opportunities to work more with China rather than less. And this is something which I think we need to think through very carefully because obviously there are some risks. But, it's an opportunity there. I'm not sure what sort of thinking Europe is doing. I think it is getting actually very, very scared in the way it approaches this, but not necessarily looking at what they actually can do together. One example is actually, I think very recent, is around climate change. China is very interested in climate change because it has picked up the issue, but also because it wants to do business in green economy. And it's very clear, it's very much there. And it's one issue in which EU and China have actually started to have a very, very positive dialogue. Can we ask if there are other issues on which the EU and China can work more together? And I think this would be probably also a more productive way to look at this. I'm not undermining the risks. I think there are, but I feel we probably need to rebalance a little bit the conversation and be also probably a bit more humble on what sort of role we want to have in the world, in a world which is today much more multipolar. I'm not sure that having just being scared about what's going on, it's gonna do to you any good. On what the EU is doing, I'm not particularly. There are some things. If you look actually, what the EU is doing is thinking in how it engages with middle-income countries outside, and is a very interesting policy discussion which is going on in terms of looking at how to work together with more advanced middle-income countries. And I think this is a discussion which can also influence the way we work with China, but also with India, with other big countries out there. And I think that one is an interesting conversation to follow. And it goes well beyond development cooperation. It goes to, in terms of what sort of financial cooperation you can have, but also what sort of business interests you can have, what sort of global issues you can work together. And, you know, it's an opportunity out there. I'm not sure how much the EU is going to take that up, but it's, you know, put on the agenda and it's there up for discussion.
Thank you, Andrew.
On this question, I mean, I think it was 2008, the EU said, well, we want to have an EU-China-Africa dialogue, and we want to sort that out. We want to have a dialogue. We want to have a trilateral dialogue on these issues. Well, what happened? Well, they set out the things. The Europeans turned up. The Chinese turned up. The Africans said, well, hang on a minute. What's in it for us? Why would we engage in a trilateral dialogue? And Europe couldn't really articulate very well, and there was a lot of perspectives on hidden agenda. But that was one European approach about 10 years ago, to say, well, if China's in Africa, we're in Africa. How can we have a trilateral dialogue on this? Since then, I think things have moved on, and I mean, it's more. I mean, there's quite a lot. If you look at the global strategy, there's quite a lot in there that is more. I mean, it's a foreign policy strategy, so there's more in there about how the EU engages with the rest of the world that you can extrapolate to what it thinks of China in Africa and engaging on that. I know, for example, there was one thing that really upset the Commission is in terms of how they were spending their development aid, whereby they were saying, okay, so we're giving a lot of money to infrastructure in Africa. We are, you know, it is money that is not tied, and what we're noticing is who's winning all these contracts and implementing these projects. Well, it's Chinese companies. Well, to me, you can look at it positively and say, well, this is untied aid. Who put in the best bids and who did it? The fact that they're Chinese, does that make a difference? Or are there more concerns? And I think there was within DevCo, the Development Cooperation arm of the Commission, there was quite a lot of concerns that, is this what we want our development assistance to be going towards? So there was thinking about that. And also, there's the UK is, I mean, the EU is putting a lot of money into Africa Peace and Security Architecture, and which supposedly creates a safer environment in Africa. It's Africa Peace and Security Architecture, and there's a lot of anger from the Europeans that China is not putting any money into this and is also benefiting.
Why would they?
Sorry?
Why would they?
Why would they? Well, again, it's you know, I mean, China did promise various things towards Africa Peace and Security Architecture with the African Union, and didn't quite follow through on the resources there. But yeah, so is there some thinking? Is there some concern? Is there some anger? Is there some? Well, what do we do about this? Yes, absolutely. On the African Union and the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, I think from our perspective, we would have loved the African Union at a fairly early stage in the process of the post-Cotonou negotiations to come out with a very strong African position that was already agreed at heads of state level, that went through the internal processes, that made a strong pitch for, you know, the African Union is the political voice on the continent. It's the body with legitimacy. If you want to have a future agreement, it needs to be place the African Union at its heart and the African Union member states at its heart. The African Union didn't yet. There were a few officials within the African Union Commission who were keen on it, but politically they couldn't quite get the traction at that moment in time to do it. So I think it would be the best for EU-Africa relations and EU-Africa-Caribbean-Pacific relations if the homework and the preparation was done on the continents or in the regions, so that when Europe comes along and goes, well, this is our position, you get, well, that's your position, this is our position that we've thought through ourselves. It's not just a response to your position. And it hasn't happened yet. And you can speculate on maybe do you want to change a body that's existed for a long time? Can you mobilize the political level to make that choice before something is put on the table or not? It's quite hard to do so. On Burundi and the EU, yeah, well, I think there's incoherences there. Again, I don't know so much about Burundi, I have to say. I've been there only once. But this, that European companies try to make economic gain regardless of what the policy line coming out of the EU is common. And Europe has tried to set up some voluntary codes and some things on raw materials that are promote human rights standards. But it's not always there, and it's also, you tend to get some companies are quite good at compliance, but other companies see it as an opportunity, including European companies. Interesting, you mentioned the ICC. The Cotonou Partnership Agreement in the past had a clause in it that to sign up to this, you had to sign up to the ICC as well. So there's a question, if you're negotiating a follow-up agreement to that's a legal agreement, and you have a growing number of countries in Africa who are skeptical of signing up to the ICC, where does this leave the future Cotonou Partnership Agreement? Will it be, because this agreement is an international agreement, it has to be ratified by parliaments. Will that happen? Or will you see increasingly governments going, well, actually, no, I don't think we want to do this because we don't want to commit. So I think that's and the ICC is one issue that there are different views, but it's not on the agenda. I mean, that would be another hot button issue to say, okay, we have a difference of opinion on this. Let's put it on the EU-Africa summit agenda, and let's put trade on the agenda. So it's not just a European agenda about saying, well, these are the difficult things we want to discuss with Africa, that African governments will come up and say, okay, these are the things that we want to discuss with Europe. You may not want to discuss them, but we want to discuss them with you. And it's not there, yet. But it would be good if it was.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mariella. I think what we have heard is a very complex relationship. EU is a complex organization, and when it's going to deal with a very complex and changing world, it becomes even more complex. And what comes out probably most clearly from what you have said are all the incoherences. I mean, the difficulties of solving problems by and in that way doing two things at the same time, one not coherent with other. And I think the questions that were raised about the problems arising now in Africa because of internal problems will not be solved by this incoherence by EU. And this is scary in a way, because I mean, who is going to be the one who keeps up dialogue with African countries when they are shrinking the space for civil society, when they are making it more difficult for opposition parties and making democracy difficult to work, and of course human rights issues and equality between gender and so on, gender equality.
Yeah, but we also have some of those same issues in Europe.
Yes,
so
I mean it reflects, of course, it's the member states. So what we are talking about are the member states and their joint policies, and of course when they are dealt with in a very complex organization such as EU. But I think, thank you very much for illuminating us on these very complex issues, and I think you have done exactly what I expected and hoped from you. Thank you very much.
It's a fund of information on different things in more detail than I can do here. It's all, we create public goods, so it's all available for free on the website, and if you get stuck, then you can always email me and I can find you the right person to talk to or get more information from.
Thank you.
Yes.